When, sir, is it you say that you saw Anitra last?
He woke up, we talked, we had sex. I know she left like around 11.
And your soulmate, your girlfriend, walked out of the house with no shoes on?
We begin tonight following breaking news out of Peach County. After 7 days of testimony and 3 hours of deliberation, jurors found Demarcus Little guilty of murder in connection with the February 2020 death of his girlfriend, Fort Valley State student Anitra Gunn.
My son didn't do this. He was raised the right way. He's not violent, never been in a fight, never having a criminal background. He's a good kid, a good soldier, serving our country.
It was Valentine's Day, February 14th, 2020, a day that's supposed to be about love. A day that's supposed to be warm and beautiful. But for one family in Georgia, that day would become the day their world fell apart, and nothing would ever be the same again. Her name was Anitra Gunn. She was 23 years old, young, bright, and full of life. She was a senior at Fort Valley State University, a college located in the small town of Fort Valley, Georgia. She was studying agriculture, and she was so close to the finish line. That same year, she was supposed to graduate. She had plans. She had goals. She had a future that was just beginning to open up in front of her. Before Fort Valley, Anitra had grown up in the Atlanta area. She attended Westlake High School in Fulton County, and people who knew her back then would tell you she was the kind of person who showed up. She worked hard. She stayed focused. And even when life got busy at university, she still found time to work part-time at a local restaurant called the 1836 Restaurant and Lounge. She was doing everything right. One of the things people closest to Anitra always said was that she stayed in contact with her family. Her father lived back in the Atlanta area, and she would check in regularly. That was just who she was. So when February 14th came and went, and her phone went silent, the people who loved her knew, deep in their hearts, that something was terribly wrong. But before we get to that day, we need to go back just a little bit further. Because the warning signs, they didn't start on Valentine's Day. They started much earlier. About 9 days before Anitra disappeared, on February 5th, 2020, something frightening happened at her apartment. Someone had smashed the windows of her home. They had also slashed the tires on her car. Think about that for a moment. Someone came to where this young woman lived, the place that was supposed to be her safe space, and they destroyed it. The police were called. And the person who was later charged with that crime? It was her own boyfriend, a man named Demarcus Little. He was arrested and charged with criminal damage to property. And here's the part that breaks your heart even more. Investigators later found out that this wasn't even the first time someone had slashed Anitra's tires. There had been an earlier incident. But that time, Anitra hadn't reported it to police. Maybe she was scared. Maybe she didn't want things to escalate. Maybe she thought it would pass. We'll never know exactly what was going through her mind. But what we do know is that the danger around her was growing, and on February 14th, 2020, it reached her. That morning, Anitra was last seen at a house on Greer Road in Fort Valley. It was the home of Demarcus Little's aunt. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. As the hours passed, her family tried to reach her. Calls went unanswered. Text messages went unread. For a young woman who always responded quickly, who always stayed in touch, the silence was deafening. Her family knew. They just knew. And so the search for Anitra Gunn began. When someone you love goes missing, every detail matters. Every single piece of information feels like it could be the key, the thing that leads you to them, the thing that brings them home. Anitra's family and the people who cared about her were clinging to every possible clue. And on February 15th, 2020, just 1 day after she was last seen, investigators found something that would become one of the most important pieces of the entire case. They found Anitra's car. Her 2013 Chevy Cruze was sitting on Bell Street, just 1 block from her Fort Valley apartment. At first glance, you might think, okay, the car is here, maybe she's nearby. But when officers got a closer look, they realized something was very wrong. The front bumper of the vehicle was completely missing. Gone. And inside the car, they found her wallet. Her phone body was there too, separate from everything else. But Anitra? She was nowhere to be found. Now, a missing bumper might not sound like much, but in an investigation, the smallest things can open up the biggest doors. That bumper, or rather, the absence of it, told investigators that something violent had happened. The car hadn't just been parked there. Something had occurred, and the story of what happened was written right there if you knew how to read it. There were pieces of brush and small sticks caught inside the grille of the car. Tiny fragments of nature, the kind of thing you'd pick up if a vehicle had been driven into a wooded area. Those little details pointed investigators toward the trees, toward the rural roads, toward the stretches of land that stretch out around Peach County and Crawford County in Georgia. That's where they needed to look. Once the car was found and the scope of what might have happened became clear, law enforcement moved quickly. This wasn't just one department working alone. They put together a multi-agency task force, and it included some of the biggest law enforcement names in Georgia. The Fort Valley Police Department was there. The Peach County Sheriff's Office joined in. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the GBI, took a major role. And so did the Georgia State Patrol. Together, they launched one of the most intensive searches that region had seen in a long time. Ground teams combed through the woods. Helicopters flew overhead. Volunteers, regular people from the community who simply couldn't sit still while a young woman was missing, joined the search. Authorities put out a public plea, asking people in the area to keep their eyes open. They mentioned the missing bumper specifically. They wanted people to know what to look for. 3 days passed. 3 days of searching, hoping, praying. 3 days of Anitra's family holding on to the possibility that maybe, somehow, she was still out there. Maybe she was hurt. Maybe she needed help. Maybe they would find her in time. But on February 18, 2020, the hope ended. Officers searching a wooded area near the Peach-Crawford County line found her. Anitra Gunn's body was there, partially hidden beneath sticks and brush, beside a quiet, two-lane rural road. And nearby, part of her car's missing bumper had been found at the same location. When the medical examiner conducted the autopsy, the results confirmed what investigators had feared. Anitra's death was ruled a homicide. She had been killed by strangulation, by manual force applied to her neck. Someone had taken her life with their own hands. Just like that, the search for a missing young woman became a murder investigation. And now, the question wasn't just where is Anitra, it was who did this to her, and why. There are moments in a criminal investigation when everything shifts. When the facts that have been quietly gathering, the phone records, the witness statements, the physical evidence, start to form a picture. And in the case of Anitra Gunn, that picture pointed in one direction. From the very beginning, Demarcus Little had been on investigators' radar. He was Anitra's boyfriend. He had been at the house where she was last seen on the morning of February 14th. He had already been arrested just weeks earlier for destroying her property, smashing her windows, slashing her tires. He was not a stranger. He was someone she knew, someone she trusted. And that made everything about this case all the more painful. Shortly after Anitra's body was found and her identity was confirmed, law enforcement moved forward with formal charges. They secured warrants charging Demarcus Little with malice murder. The language in those documents was stark and cold, that he had unlawfully and with malice caused the death of Gunn by manual strangulation on the morning of Valentine's Day. Little had been briefly released on bail after the earlier property damage charge. But after the murder charge was announced, he was denied bond. He wasn't going anywhere. But Little wasn't the only person police were looking at. As investigators dug deeper, another name came up. A man named Jivon Abron. Abron was a friend of Little's, and later in February 2020, he was also arrested. The charges against Abron were serious, making false statements to investigators and concealing a death. Prosecutors alleged that Abron had helped Little in the aftermath of the killing, that instead of going to the police, instead of getting help, he had assisted in hiding what had happened to Anitra. That is a choice that would follow Jivon Abron for the rest of his life. Now, here's where the digital age becomes so important to this story. When investigators began pulling phone records, analyzing location data, and studying the metadata from devices used by the people involved, they started building a timeline. A picture of where people had been, when they had been there, and who they had been communicating with. These weren't just clues. They were pieces of a puzzle that prosecutors would use to tell the full story of what happened to Anitra on February 14, 2020. Friends and people who knew Anitra were interviewed. They confirmed that she had been with Little that morning, that she had been at that house on Greer Road. They talked about her last known movements, her plans, her state of mind. None of them had any idea that it was the last time they would ever see her. And then there was Javon Abram himself. Because in a twist that no one could have predicted, Abram didn't stay silent. When prosecutors presented his testimony in court, he told a story that would become one of the most powerful pieces of the entire case. He said that Demarcus Little had confessed to him, that Little had told him what he had done to Anitra. And according to Abram, the two of them had moved sections of the detached bumper and disposed of parts of it in locations that matched exactly what law enforcement had already found. Think about that. The same bumper that police used to trace their search through the woods, pieces of it had been moved and scattered by the very people involved. And Abram had been there. He had known. And instead of speaking up, he had stayed quiet until he couldn't anymore. The case was building. The evidence was coming together. And in March of 2022, more than 2 years after Anitra lost her life, Demarcus Little stood trial. 2 years is a long time to wait for answers. 2 years of grief, 2 years of questions, 2 years of a family waking up every single day with the weight of what had happened sitting on their chests. But in March of 2022, the courtroom in Georgia became the place where the full story of what happened to Anitra Gunn would finally be told, out loud, in front of a jury, with all the evidence laid bare. The trial lasted about a week. And during that time, both the prosecution and the defense brought everything they had. The prosecution built their case piece by piece. They introduced the cell phone data, the location records that placed people at specific locations at specific times. They brought in text messages exchanged between Little and Anitra. They walked the jury through the physical evidence, the car with the missing bumper, the brush in the grill, the rural road where Anitra's body had been found, and the matching bumper pieces recovered nearby. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when they called Javon Abram to the stand. Abram told the jury what he told investigators, that Little had confessed to him, that Little had told him he had killed Anitra, and that the two of them had moved pieces of that bumper, trying to cover their tracks. It was the kind of testimony that changes the air in a courtroom, the kind of words that hang in the silence after they're spoken. Demarcus Little also took the stand in his own defense. He offered his version of events. He tried to explain away the inconsistencies. He pushed back against the prosecution's narrative. It is, of course, the right of any person on trial to defend themselves, and Little exercised that right. But the jury was listening carefully to everything. After all the testimony was done, after all the evidence had been presented, after both sides had made their final arguments, the jury went to deliberate. And in less than 3 hours, they came back. They found Demarcus Little guilty of felony murder and aggravated assault in the death of Anitra Gunn. He was acquitted on the malice murder charge. That charge requires the prosecution to prove an intent to kill with ill will, and the jury found that the evidence didn't meet that specific standard. But on felony murder and aggravated assault, there was no doubt. The verdict was clear. When Superior Court Judge Connie Williford handed down the sentence, it was the maximum that Georgia law allows. Demarcus Little was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Let that sink in. He will never be free again. For what he did to Anitra Gunn, for taking her life on what should have been a day of love, he will spend the rest of his days behind bars. Assistant District Attorney Neil Halverson spoke after the verdict. He reflected on the evidence, on the digital records, on the testimony that had been carefully built up over 2+ years of investigation. He acknowledged what it had taken to get to that moment. And behind his words, you could feel the weight of it all. The loss of a young woman who deserved so much better, and the long, hard road that had led to justice. The jury had spoken. The judge had ruled. And for the first time in more than 2 years, Anitra's name had been heard in a courtroom. Not as a missing person, not as a victim file, but as a young woman whose life mattered, whose story deserved to be told, and whose killer had finally been held to account. After the verdict, after the sentence, After the courtroom doors close and the legal proceedings come to an end, the grief doesn't go away. Justice and healing are not the same thing. And for the people who loved Anitra Gunn, no verdict could ever give them back what they lost. The community around Fort Valley felt this deeply. The Peach County Sheriff's Office and law enforcement officials who had worked the case spoke publicly after the conviction. They acknowledged the enormous amount of resources that had gone into finding Anitra, identifying what had happened to her, and building the case that ultimately put her killer away. It wasn't one person working one case. It was an entire region, multiple agencies, multiple departments, coming together for one young woman. Thanks for watching. While you are here, please hit the subscribe button and comment your view on the story and where you're watching from.